The human population. We are finally here to some very controversial topics. The human population size, affluence, resource consumption, they all are interrelated and they all impact the environment. Probably one of the best examples that most of my students know is China. China is striking with more than 1.3 billion people. That's almost 20% of all humans live in China. Human populations undergo change in a variety of natural and societal conditions, and these populations, they change over time. Some of these changes occur with like a specific pattern that can be described and explained. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the demographic transitions and these effects that these transitions have on the environment and the relationship between this economic development and sustainability. So by the end of this session, you should be able to describe how demographic transition follows economic development, explain how the relationships among population size, economic development, and resource consumption influence the environment. And then describe why sustainable development is commonplace, but it's just our ultimate goal, okay? So we've talked about in the past here that populations in different countries change over time, and the population of Earth is also fluctuating. So demographers are interested in understanding the reason behind all these fluctuations in population growth in the past, whether they can apply it to contemporary issues or even future demographic issues. You know, we will begin this session here by looking at an important theory of how populations change. And we'll also look at a family planning because, it's essentially an important component of a demographic transition. Historically, nations that have gone through similar processes of economic development have experienced similar patterns of population growth. And scientists who have studied these population growth patterns, of like Europe, for example, in the early 1900s, describe a four-phase process that they refer to as demographic transition. And so we now call that the theory of demographic transition. And that means that a country moves from a subsistence economy to an industrialization, and that increased affluence, when that happens, it undergoes some sort of predictable shift in population growth. So the four phases of the demographic transition are shown on the next slide here. And so essentially they go from being a maintenance or a support of your own livelihood type of economy to increasing the state of having plentiful of wealth, possessions, money. And, this is a trend that we see. So this theory models the way that birth, death, and growth rates for a nation can change with economic development. And phase one is what we call pre-industrial period, and we know that by high birth rates and even high death rates. And then a country will enter into phase two, and that is society begins to become industrialized. They move out of that maintenance phase, and so death rates tend to drop, but birth rates actually do not change. But the population growth is at its greatest point in phase three. In phase three, birth rates start to decline for a variety of reasons, family choice, or, China institutes a law. And so we see the greatest increase in population size there. And then phase four, the population stops growing and sometimes even begins to decline, and so the birth rate tends to drop. So the theory of demographic transition, while helpful as a learning tool, it does really not adequately describe the population growth patterns of some developing countries. either today or even during the last century. Both birth and death rates have declined rapidly in a number of developing countries because of a variety of factors, and we don't entirely understand all of these things yet. In some developed nations, governments have taken measures to improve healthcare and sanitation, and that usually will improve life, but then they will promote birth control in spite of the country's poverty. So, despite any limitations that the theory of demographic transition has, it's worth examining in more detail because it allows us to at least understand the way that some countries influence the environment and undergo growth and development and help us predict conditions that can happen to the environment. So, very quickly here, phase one is a slow population growth, and it represents a population that is nearing a steady state. The size of the population does not change very quickly. There are high birth rates, and there are also high death rates. And in these countries, life expectancy for adults is relatively short, and that's usually just due to some sort of difficulty that's like dangerous working conditions or the lack of health care, childhood disease, infant mortality, poor sanitation. There's a long list, right? Phase two is a rapid population growth. And in this phase, death rates decline while birth rates kind of remain high. And as a result, the population grows rapidly. As the country begins to modernize and better sanitation and plumbing and clean drinking water, and people have access to food and goods and resources and healthcare, and then of course childhood vaccines. All of this reduces their infant mortality rate. And however, even though that is reduced, couples still continue to have large families because it takes at least one generation for this large family idea to basically go away. It takes time to implement an education system and birth control measures and family planning measures. All right, so phase three is a stable population growth. So in this phase, just in general, a family income has increased, and people are starting to have fewer children, and as a result, the crude birth rate begins to fall. But at phase three is typical of of developed countries, including the United States and China. The United States and Canada are all experience and like to stay in phase three. So why do people produce fewer children when their income increases anyway? Society changes from this subsistence economy of farming with very complex economic specializations and having large numbers of children may become more financially burdened if there's no economic benefit of having a large family. So in this phase, people spend a lot of time pursuing education, and the availability of birth control is affluent out there, and the likelihood that people will have smaller families is really high. However, it's important to note that cultural and societal and religious norms also play a role in birth rate. And as birth rates and death rates are starting to decrease in phase three, the system of returns is a steady rate. Population growth levels off at phase four because low birth rates and low death rates kind of cancel each other out. So at stage three, it's starting to level out. Phase four is this level out transition to decline in population growth. It's characterized by a declining population size and has a relatively high affluent economic development. And when you think about countries like this, what comes to mind is Japan. Japan and Italy are staying in phase four. They are countries with the crude birth rate and the far is well below the crude death rate. So this declining population in phase four means that fewer young people are out there and a higher portion of elderly people are out there. And so this demographic shift can have an important societal and economic effect, right? With fewer people in the labor force and more people retiring and working part-time, the ratio of dependent elderly people to wage earning people increases. And so the cost of pension programs and other services that will require healthcare or tax burdens on this younger population increases. And there may be a shortage of healthcare workers entirely just due to the elderly population in the country. So governments in areas like this encourage immigration, people to move into the country, and they offer like financial incentives as a source to get additional workers. In some countries like Japan, actually, the government provides economic incentives to encourage families to actually have more children. So it's just amazing to me that a boat ride away, they're not allowed to have children, and then there's this actual encouragement to have more children. Now, recent studies on this whole demographic shift in this highly developed area region actually show once the population reaches this like all-time low of a 1.2 replacement, then women will start to actually have more children. It's somewhat easier for a woman to raise children if she chooses to when you're in a high affluent area. So when this rate becomes at an all-time low and the country is actually very, very wealthy, it starts to do this turnaround where women, it becomes like somewhat easier to raise children in great numbers with nannies and, I think you can afford that type of thing. So then you'll start to see this real increase in birth rate, where a lot of single only children start to have larger and larger families.